All right. Welcome. I see the participants leveling off, so we may get a few more people. I am very excited for this next conversation in which we think about how to tell and teach the stories of women's suffrage and more broadly, women and empowerment. I'm especially interested in after having spent a semester teaching a course on the 19th Amendment as a lens for understanding gender, politics, and empowerment, and blogging that course. So I can't wait to hear the discussion about to come up. We have two speakers. They're each going to take about 10 minutes to talk, and then we're going to open it up for a full discussion with them and with everybody else is here. As always, you can put your questions into the Q&A and I will moderate that. So first, we're going to hear from Jill Hasday, who is the Distinguished McKnight University Professor and Centennial Professor in Law at the University of Minnesota Law School. Her most recent book is Intimate Lies and the Law, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. She's been studying how textbooks treat this important aspect of our history, and that's what she'll be talking about. And then following immediately after that is Rachel Tiven, who is a civil rights activist currently in residence at the Columbia Law School. She spent 15 years leading LGBT and immigrant rights organization, Immigration, Equality, Lambda Legal, and Immigrant Justice Corps, and has spent the past year embodying the Twitter persona, the Daily Suffragist, who I absolutely adore. So we are going to hear from Jill, and then Rachel, and then we'll let it rock and roll in open conversation. Jill, take it away.
Okay, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here, and I really appreciate Linda and Virginia's organizational energy and BU sponsoring of this conference. My remarks today are based on an essay I'm working on entitled We the Men. I'm interested in your thoughts about the essay itself because it's a work in progress. And I'm also going to use the essay as the seed for my next book. So I'd be very interested in your ideas for what I should include in that book and what additional examples I could think about. The overarching point of the essay is that too often America's stories about itself exclude women's struggles for equality. Supreme Court justices, politicians, textbook authors, or other commentators constructing and disseminating these stories either ignore women's struggles entirely or distort them beyond recognition by insisting that women have already won. I argue that remembering women's struggles more frequently and more accurately can help advance sex equality. In my time today, I'm going to highlight 4 themes from the essay, focusing on examples about how the 19th Amendment is remembered and misremembered. The first theme is erasure. Americans often forget women's struggles for equality when they remember American history. My essay uses 3 sets of examples. The first focuses on the Supreme Court. The court has repeatedly suggested that women have achieved equal rights through what I call men's spontaneous enlightenment, rather than women's struggles against tremendous resistance. Think about the account of women's legal history that the plurality in Frontiero offered in 1973. Without really acknowledging it, this account only focused on privileged white women who white men had placed on a pedestal that proved to be a cage. Frontiero also suggested that men in their great wisdom had simply given women the 19th Amendment, and that Congress on its own had decided that the ERA would be a good idea. These strategic omissions helped the justices attribute persistent restrictions on women's rights to the benevolent paternalism of male lawmakers rather than their fervent opposition to feminist reform. They also allowed the justices to credit improvements in women's status as the product of men's enlightenment rather than women's struggle. Decades later, in 2015, the Supreme Court reviewed the legal history of marriage. The court observed that women's legal, political, and property rights had expanded over time, but avoided mentioning the feminist mobilization that sparked those developments. On the court's account, society simply began to understand that women have their own equal dignity. Here again, changes in women's status appear to spring from spontaneous enlightenment rather than feminist mobilization. Women and their struggles for equality are also frequently missing when the court reflects on its history of constitutional decision-making more broadly, suggesting that the court doesn't understand sex discrimination as a core constitutional concern. For instance, the court endlessly criticizes and remembers its decision in Lochner. Lochner is one of the worst insults that justices can hurl at each other. But Lochner was paired with another decision, Muller v. Oregon, which held that states could restrict women's working hours even though states had to leave men unconstrained. The court doesn't discuss Muller often, even in cases about women's rights. Mullerism isn't a notorious insult or even a term in circulation. I think I'm the only one who uses that word. The second set of examples I use to illustrate how women's struggles for equality are forgotten focuses on official and scholarly pronouncements about constitutional history and constitutional law. Constitutional law scholars don't include cases about women's rights when listing the most important or most terrible constitutional precedents. And government officials pontificating at bicentennial celebrations and the like routinely praise the founders for establishing government by the consent of the governed without acknowledging that the founders denied rights of self-government to every woman and many men. My third set of examples about how women's struggles are forgotten involves national monuments and the bronze ceiling. Monuments mirror and mold the nation's collective memory, and millions visit them every year to learn about America. Yet our monuments rarely include stories about women or women's activism, and officials sometimes shunt the few monuments that recognize women to the side. For example, a 2017 survey found that only about 2% of the national park sites, 9 out of 411, commemorated women's history. I'll turn now to the second theme that runs through misremembrances about women's struggles for equality. I call this theme distortion. The basic idea is that when America does remember women's struggles for equality, the remembrances often overstate the extent of change over time and forget what remains undone, even to the point of contending that sex equality has already been achieved. The Supreme Court has announced the achievement of sex equality early and often, beginning decades before the 19th Amendment was ratified and continuing to the present day. For more than a century, many of these rosy pronouncements have appeared in decisions denying women equal rights. I call these self-contradictory declarations of equality achieved because the justices' own actions contradict their assurances that women have nothing to worry or complain about. But the court has long relied on proclamations about women's progress to defend decisions impeding that progress. The idea being that if America has already achieved sex equality, whatever women are complaining about in court can't be such a big deal after all. The judicial inclination to declare sex equality achieved reflects and reinforces a broader American pattern. Well before the 19th century's ratification, textbooks for elementary and secondary school children were insisting that women had equal rights and opportunities. Such announcements became more frequent in the decades after 1920 as textbooks highlighted white women's voting and ignored how many women of color remained disenfranchised. Textbooks from the middle decades of the 20th century frequently insisted that America had established sex equality through consensus rather than conflict, as enlightened men allied with reform-minded women. Unsurprisingly, these consensual accounts of women's history overlooked or underemphasized the powerful opposition that suffragists fought for decades. Indeed, they often described enfranchising women as a logical inevitability. Assumptions about the inevitability of women's enfranchisement are easy to make now, when the 19th Amendment is no longer controversial. But these accounts gloss over the uncomfortable reality that many Americans at the time did not think democracy required female voting. Remember that the 19th Amendment passed the Senate with just 2 votes to spare. Ratifying the 19th Amendment required agreement from 36 states, so supporters could afford no more than 12 holdouts. By the time Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify, 8 states had already rejected the 19th Amendment. Winning in Tennessee took a tireless campaign that almost lost. Tennessee famously approved the 19th Amendment with no votes to spare. In retrospect, I think it's easy to see how textbooks from previous eras sanitize women's struggles for equality at a time when sex discrimination remained legal and pervasive. But many K-12 textbooks from more recent years continue to gloss over the opposition that women's rights activists have encountered while overstating the extent of reform. For example, exaggerations of the 19th Amendment's impact are common. Textbooks regularly report that the amendment guaranteed all women the vote or even made women first-class citizens. The 19th Amendment did end sex-based voting prohibitions, but it neither guaranteed all women the vote nor established sex equality more generally. Many women of color remained disenfranchised for decades after the 19th Amendment, and legalized sex discrimination was pervasive. The third theme in the essay is called consequences. This theme explores how a distorted vision of women's past shapes the present, warping both judicial reasoning and political advocacy. The Supreme Court often describes sex discrimination as archaic, medieval, outdated, outworn, outmoded, or an old notion. Those terms sound like insults, and they function that way in some respects. But they simultaneously suggest that sex discrimination is a historical artifact rather than a modern problem. Drawing on this rhetoric, the court has used the premise that the nation has left sex discrimination behind as support for decisions upholding women's exclusion from military registration, sex-specific statutory rape laws, and a sex-based rule governing the citizenship of non-marital children born abroad. How could these policies reflect sex stereotypes if America and the court have moved beyond gendered reasoning? Outside the courts, anti-feminist activists have exploited and reinforced the American inclination to overstate the improvements in women's status. Asserting that America has already established sex equality is a common way to defend the status quo and oppose expanding women's rights. Phyllis Schlafly's campaign against the ERA relied on such arguments, and Schlafly's ideological heirs are still deploying them. I'll turn to my last theme, hope. The limits of our collective memory can constrict our collective imaginations. Women have had to fight for equality against vehement opposition that has slowed change and limited progress. Erasing women's struggles for equality from our collective memory, or assuming those struggles have already been won, supports complacency and undercuts reform. These ways of misremembering teach us that sex discrimination has not been an essential feature of American life, and assure us that the issue has already been resolved. They allow us to criticize practices the nation has purportedly abandoned, while directing attention away from practices that persist. They tell us that women should be satisfied with their lot, and further improvement is undertaken. We can learn from the past to change the future. Exploring the history of women's struggles for equality reveals the persistence of sex discrimination in the United States and makes clear that conflict rather than consensus has driven improvements in women's status. Women seeking to better their lives have not been able or willing to wait passively for men's enlightened benevolence. Male-dominated society did not spontaneously or naturally decide that women's subordination was a problem. Instead, women have secured new rights and opportunities by identifying grievances, demanding change, and combating powerful opposition. In my view, America needs more conflict over women's status, not less. Conflict can produce change, complacency cannot. Incorporating a richer and truer history of women's struggles for equality into our collective memory can sharpen our understanding of how reform takes place, focus our scrutiny on the battles that are still not won, and renew our determination to push for a more equal future. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Oh, wow. I love Mullerism. I'm really excited to be here and to talk a little bit about my adventures on Twitter, on social media in general, and Twitter in particular. Some of people, Corinne in particular, is an avid and wonderful presence on Twitter. And it is simultaneously a mind-expanding opportunity to be a fly on 100 walls. And it is the most addictive, time-wasting echo chamber ever invented. But it is a really irresistible chance to reach a more diverse audience than any classroom and to share things that people didn't know that they didn't know. And so because it's so unique in that way as compared to other kinds of public history projects, right? If you contrast it with a museum or even the best website, right? Those things still need an audience that decides to visit. And with Daily Suffragist on Twitter, on Instagram, and on Facebook, I can come to where you are. And that is what has made it such an irresistible teaching tool. But it is a balancing act all the time. So I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which it really functions, in which I've tried to balance accessibility, audience, content, style, and a whole host of other things. So I am trying to write for a popular audience, right? This is not dissertation by tweet, right? I really try to do a lot of framing. I try to spell out acronyms. I try to situate people in time and give context for who they are or why you haven't heard of them. And sometimes what I found is that offends my more knowledgeable readers. So for example, when I referred to Anna Dickinson and her speech to a joint session of Congress and to President Abraham Lincoln, when she spoke for more than an hour with no notes about the progress of the war and a critique of the president in his presence, and I described her as unknown, a terrific women's historian wrote to say, she's not unknown, we've been writing about her for years. And I appreciate that, but that's, that's, I'm not trying to talk to the people who had already heard of Anna Dickinson. And at the same time, I would be lying if I said that I didn't care what scholars think. Early on in a year of posting every day, beginning on August 26th, 2019, and continuing daily, I thought I was going to go for a year, but I'm having so much fun that I have decided to continue. So I still post every day. But early on in that year, I got a note from Ellen Du Bois saying, "You're doing a good job." And that really meant the world to me. And it also raised the stakes, right? Because I am trying to write both for people who have never heard of these stories before and other people who literally wrote the books that I am reading. So trying to say something useful to both. Another balancing act is really content, right? And trying to feed the hunger for lesser known stories. And what I see in the analytics from Twitter, which if people want to talk about that, we can certainly talk about that in Q&A, is that, that the content that does really well, gets a lot of likes and a lot of retweets, is my Black suffragist content and my LGBTQ content. And some of that is because those are the new and different stories, and some of that is the self-reinforcing nature of Twitter and the following that I've built, right? A big tweet brings in more followers, and they then like the tweets that resemble the tweet they originally liked, right? So that it, sort of, if you want to move people into some new content, that takes some work. And I've been happy to see that actually, stories of some oddball white women that I think are not going to be big sellers do in fact get pretty good pickup if they've got a picture and a snappy lead. And so a snappy lead obviously is really important in all kinds of writing, not just popular writing, academic writing too. But what I really realized is writing for Twitter is sort of like writing for TV. I was a print reporter, print journalist many years ago, and then moved into a job where I had to write for TV news. And the guy who taught me how to write for TV news wanted me to write in shorter, declarative sentences. And I said, "You want me to dumb it down?" And he said, "I don't want you to dumb it down. I want you to make it accessible to people so they can hear it." And Twitter is a lot like that. So that's right. That's what I'm trying to do. The voice that I use with Daily Suffragist is also a balancing act, right? That I think that the fact that it has a point of view is part of what makes it unique, right? I'm not, if you read Daily Suffragist every single day, you would think the Daily Suffragist is queer and probably Jewish. And if you clicked on the link in the bio, then you would be sure of those things. And it was important to me that the project was never anonymous. That was not my goal. And at the same time, it's not me exactly, right? In the very first week that I started posting, I had a really important to me and meaningful exchange with Michelle Duster, Ida B. Wells' great-granddaughter and this generation's keeper of the Ida flame. And I asked for her permission to use Ida's avatar for Twitter. And she said she really wants the story to be told, and absolutely. And I am very aware every day that I am a white woman putting words out into the world that have Ida's picture on them. So trying to balance sort of those two identities. The other balancing act that has been really important to me is the immediacy of it, right? I mean that when Twitter is at its best, it is just such a vital and vivid, real-time commentary. And so in the first weeks after George Floyd's murder and the exposure of Breonna Taylor's murder, I posted a lot about the British suffragists and the really incredible direct action, the Pankhurst's arson campaign in 1913 in the UK, and a lot about the direct action work of the US movement, the history of a variety of critiques of what the right way to protest is. And some of those posts are the posts that I am the most proud of, right? Where I was really able to connect an underappreciated stories of our past with this sort of hyper timely direct line to the present. And the balancing act is also that sometimes they're not as good as that, right? I mean, that the discipline for me of writing every day and of trying to write new content every day means that they're not all brilliant and they're not all perfect and they don't all capture exactly the moment the way I wish I did. And yet, if it's 11:59 at night and I haven't done it that day, I got to hit tweet. And even on the days when I worked really hard and I'm really proud of it and I think I have it, I still don't know if there were one more source, would I get something that I had missed? Is there something that happens next that I don't know yet? But being able to accept that I have read all I can for now and I've written it as well as I can and it's time to publish, I think is a microcosm of all scholarship of all different sorts. Before we go to further discussion, I want to take one more point that I have observed in this sort of, from the vantage point of the Daily Suffragist. I am definitely not a clearinghouse for the public history suffrage centennial. And yet, I've spent a lot of time this year looking at the other kinds of popular projects, trying to reach non-academics, non-scholars with the story of the 19th Amendment, the century of struggle plus. And so I've gotten a really good bird's eye view of that stuff. And so much of it is so wonderful. I mean, the attention, especially to Black suffragists and to the role of racism in the movement and to the incompleteness of the 19th Amendment, which we've heard about this morning, and just to hear that story told as a part of the core narrative is an example of how much it matters to shift the kind of public history and make it more true and more relevant. But there is one really big thing that is missing from all of the public centennial commemorations, and that's lesbians. The homosocial world that most of the leading suffragists lived in is totally missing from this conversation. It was wonderful to hear the dean invoke Alice Stone Blackwell this morning. Alice Stone Blackwell was lesbian. She didn't use that word, but she was, by every account, someone who was attracted to and lived in an intimate social world only with women. But that's not a part of the story that we tell about her or any of these women. And I've covered all of this material in the popular realm and the public history material. I have listened to all 4 major podcast series. I have visited the marquee exhibits at the National Archives, the Library of Congress, the National Portrait Gallery. I've watched the 4-hour PBS documentary and the 1-hour Smithsonian film, and I have spent a lot of time on some gorgeous, expensively built websites, and I have watched more webinars than I can count. And other than a little bit of gawking sometimes at Dr. Walker, the visibly genderqueer Civil War surgeon, there is really almost nothing in this telling this year of the role of what today we would call lesbian sexuality and the role that played in making suffragists brave enough and iconoclastic enough to fight for a century. And it is really a historical and damaging omission. And so I hope we can discuss it more.
Thank you, both of you. Let me remind everybody out in the audience that you can put questions in the Q&A, and I will be watching that. We're going to just start a discussion, and I will pick things up from the Q&A as you bring it in. I'd like to start. I'll get the ball rolling and start where Rachel left off. As I said, when we had a private conversation the other day, it's almost like, I don't know, you could write a song that goes something like, who tells your story? And how do they tell your story? And, you know, every time I've had this kind of discussion with people, somebody says, well, you can't talk about everything. You can't talk about everything. But the question remains, all right, that's true. We can't, except for Rachel, who, if she lives long enough, she probably will have talked about everything for at least one tweet. But that's not an excuse. The question is, how do you edit? The question is, what do we put in? The question is, what do we think is core? And so at the moment, the community we're in is deeply, deeply concerned about the history of women, and it's deeply, deeply concerned about race in a very limited way. That is, for example, especially trying to bring in the stories of African-American women, and not just white women. But African-American women and white women are not the only races and ethnicities we have. Who tells the story? What else is coming in? How much are non-Christians brought into this? There were people who were not Christian. There were Jews, especially. Class is important. Do we talk about farm women? I spent many years in the Midwest, and the story is often told by those who ignore what they would call flyover country. What about women in flyover country? They're the ones who got the vote first. Fisher women. There are so many different people whose stories are here. Who tells our stories? How do we understand who we are? How do we understand what's core to this story? And how will we tell it? And I think both Rachel and Jill have brought in this question in different ways from very different perspectives. So I see some, I think some questions came in. So I'll read a first question from Elise Perot. Hi, Elise. This question is directed toward Rachel Tiven. Do you have any advice for women's history museums and other sites that tell the stories of women who are trying to break into the social media world and engage the wider public? Let me just make sure there aren't any other questions that are the same. No, and this is, by the way, her future professional interest. So, Rachel?
I think that having a point of view is really crucial, right? That the stuff that I see that when I look at what posts of Daily Suffragist seem to work well, and also as I follow lots of other people tweeting about history, I think the more you've got a clear point of view, the more in these media people grab onto it, right? The institutional things that sound like elements of your press release, or that are, right? Anything anodyne does not pick up nearly as well as something that's got a strong point of view. I should say that the absolute master of this form is Michael Harriot. And if you're not following him on Twitter, you should be, because telling a long history story in a way that really pulls his audience in is, I mean, that's, I sort of, my goal is to have like one thread that's as good as any of his, and really to sort of pull the reader in with a kind of, and guess what happened next? And so I think that, right, sort of the more you're willing to tell it, and to tell a big messy story, it doesn't have to be it's not a press release, right? It's a thread that goes somewhere. I think that's a little bit of what I've learned and what I recommend to museums and sites.
There's another question that I think would be good for both of you, and that is one that has to do with anti-suffragists. And of course, when we're telling the story of suffrage, we're also telling the story of anti-suffrage. But when we're telling the story of women and the 19th Amendment, we can't leave out the fact that there were women deeply involved in anti-suffrage organizations and movements and especially in the late 19th century, as we begin to see actual formal organizations that are anti-suffrage, there are some very prominent women who are part of that. And, you know, we already heard about Phyllis Schlafly from this century. So could you both think a little bit out loud from your perspectives about telling the story of anti-suffrage women, especially? How does the gender of those opposed to the expansion of women's rights fit into what you've read, what you've seen, what you think we ought to do?
I think the anti-suffragists are fascinating, just like, Phyllis Schlafly is a political genius. She's, fascinating figure. I think they're fascinating both for their perspective, but also the way they help the movement. Like some people say that Phyllis Schlafly killed the ERA, and there's something to that, but most of the people who voted against the ERA were men, and you have to own that, right? But her being in charge made it possible. I don't know if it was quite the same with the anti-suffragists, like you need the women opposed, but it certainly helps. I was actually just reading the New York Times coverage of suffrage, which was very unfavorable. Now they're all like, we love 19th Amendment. They didn't love it at the time. But one of their, many different arguments, but one of their arguments is they simultaneously say, like, these suffragists are so rabidly in favor of suffrage, but also, like, women don't actually want the vote. So the anti-suffragists, I think, the female anti-suffragists facilitate male anti-suffragism. And I think that's interesting. I guess the other thing I would say is the reason the anti-suffragists seem ridiculous now is because the 19th Amendment was ratified as common sense. Similarly, like if the ERA had been ratified before 1982, like Phyllis Schlafly would just seem very different to us. Like she would be the anti-suffrage of the 19th Amendment, like this crazy woman, and everyone knows that the ERA made sense. But but no one, you only live forward. So we didn't know in advance, like the anti-suffragists don't know the 19th Amendment is going to be ratified. It's super close, and they'll see
right.
that place. But
right.
Phyllis Schlafly did it, so she seems like, oh, she had some connection. She was riding a certain wave. So I think that's not I think once someone wins or someone loses, we tell ourselves that, well, the winning side made sense and the losing side was crazy, but it's not that at the time. It's all in the mix.
I think it's really interesting. One of the things about telling the story of the antis, which I have not spent a lot of time on, in part because I get to write whatever I want, but in this centennial year, again, since I'm so focused on the kind of public history work, only in the conversations about why anyone, male or female, was anti-suffrage do we get any content. Right? There's almost no substance to the discussion of what was at stake, right? We're at a point where we talk, the poignancy of celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment and the 150th birthday of the 15th Amendment this year, is that we are in a moment where people do prize their right to vote and do understand why it's precious. And we don't have to explain that voting is very important, right? 20 years ago, there wouldn't have been this kind of thickness and richness around voting as a value. But it almost, because it is meaningful today, we don't talk about patriarchy and the fear of challenging patriarchy that was at stake in the movement and the reason, right? Sometimes people ask me, well, why did it take so long, right? And the answer is because it wasn't just about civic participation, right? It was about a challenge to patriarchy wholesale. And that only shows up, ironically, in the contemporary conversation about anti-suffragists and why some people were opposed to this what they perceived to be, rightly, a massive change in the structure of power.
Our great
The New York Times didn't like that either. That definitely was the through line. Just telling you.
Let me just say we have about 10 minutes, so we're going to try to pick up as many questions as we can. Our great and brilliant colleague from the BU History Department, Paula Austin, has asked a question that goes further with the question of race and race consciousness. And she talks about how important it is, and it is to talk, when we say race, not just to talk about African Americans, but white and whiteness as a raced identity. And of course, with, again, who tells the story? As a lot of white people tell the story, whiteness, white is not a race or a raced identity. And she asks about this and how do we include this? She mentions Lawrence Santangelo's book that does it well, and discusses race privilege, middle class and race. I might expand that to class. A lot of the African American women's suffrage organizations were actually led by middle class women themselves, even if their parentage wasn't middle class, they were. And so how do we think about where white women were conscious or not conscious of their race identity? How did their race identity come into play in ways they might not have recognized? And I'll be happy to start that from when I was teaching about this and thinking about it, which was the kind of even where there wasn't exclusion, one of the things that was very interesting in a lot of suffrage organizations to me was the kind of norms and standards that women expected other women to use when they brought them in, so that the unself-consciousness of white women who were using their race and class identity to say, this is what these other women, the working class women, the Black women, other women should be like. And that's long been, of course, a class issue too, where middle class women, regardless of race, might want to be working with, say, working class women, but have a sense that if they acted properly, they'd be acting like us, namely, they'd be acting like middle class people. Do either of you have some reflections on white consciousness or the impact of white identity minus the consciousness or class?
I think one way you see whiteness come up is one strain of opposition to suffrage is this idea of women won't have enough babies and they won't take care of them, another version of a challenge to women's domestic roles. But to me, that's very much about the wrong kind of women are having too many and the right are having too few, right? It's a concern of, you see this actually in Muller too, like white Christian women from the right European countries are going to get distracted by this. And to me, that's all about, this whole concern about reproduction is all about whiteness, although it's so taken for granted that it's not even, like they don't have to say white, they can just say the race, and it has that dual meaning of human race and white race.
One of the few places that I think I see white women being self-aware of whiteness and white supremacy is in the divide between Carrie Chapman Catt and the sort of more mainstream leadership of the National American Woman Suffrage Association in the very last years, and Kate Gordon and Laura Clay. So Corinne McConaughey had a clip of Kate Gordon's writing, really vicious, this incredibly racist position that Southern white women took, that some of the leadership took, that ultimately they campaigned against the 19th Amendment. They were in Tennessee opposing a federal amendment, right? These were women who had been on the NASA board in years, in that decade, right? That they are so committed to white supremacy that they would rather no women vote than have Black women vote, and Black men have a new opportunity to exercise rights. And there's a sort of, right, so that the Catt and, right, the white women who aren't quite that, sort of like they're accommodating of white supremacy, but they're not that bad, right? That there's a little bit of self-awareness there, but otherwise, no. I don't, contemporaneously, I don't see a lot of that I have yet found, but I'm sure there's more.
We have a couple of people who are connecting the discussion with the Equal Rights Amendment. Linda McLean and Susan Lee have asked questions related to that, both for Jill in terms of how textbooks cover the ERA. If they do, what have you seen in the course of your textbook travels? And another question, how might we connect what we're learning and experiencing through this centenary with issues such as the ERA ratification and then other current issues such as abortion and so forth. But mainly, can you connect this with the ERA and its
Okay,
history?
so on the textbooks, most of them will note that the ERA didn't succeed, but they don't dwell on it because in general, they're telling a success story and the ERA failing just doesn't fit. So they don't really get into it. You know, there's the ERA, they don't really get into it. They are more talking about Title VII and Supreme Court gave constitutional protection, but the ERA, it's not like, what they're saying is accurate, you know, 35 of the 30 states. It's not like, but it's not part of they really don't want to tell it. They really don't want to tell it. I think you can see this come up with the ERA. First of all, in the modern fight over the resurgence of the ERA and what to do about the last 3 states that ratified after the deadline, the arguments that, for instance, the ERA opponents, the Republicans in Congress, just made this February are really very, very much in the Phyllis-Schlafly line. The ERA is unnecessary because women already have equality, paired with the idea that the ERA is a terrible idea because it will expand women's rights. Basically, that's the Schlafly playbook. It's unnecessary because women already have equal rights, but it's a terrible idea because it'll expand women's rights. The difference is the modern ERA opponents are really focusing on the idea that it's going to give women more abortion rights, which is fascinating because they're basically saying if we had a constitutional commitment to sex equality, that would mean more reproductive rights. And I think, though, the reason they're so honed in on abortion is most of the parade of horribles that Phyllis Schlafly suggested happened. Like, all that stuff happened. Housewives screwed a divorce. All that stuff happened, right? I mean, we don't have a draft, but there's no combat exclusion, there's same-sex marriage. All their parade of horribles basically happened. So the only thing you're left with, really, to rally is this idea of we'll get rid of restrictions on.
You forgot about the toilets. The toilets are important.
Oh, right. But I'm just, for whatever reason, the potty issue has not been center in the ERA debates I've seen. You know, when you look either at the fights at the state level over state ERAs or the federal, abortion seems to be, that's the key horrible they have. Because I think that's the
but it's been a very potent weapon against transgender people.
Transgender, right.
Right? I mean, so that coming from this same obsession with, like, right? I mean, and that these are deeply connected.
Yes, they're all connected. But, and I also think, though, like the story of the 19th Amendment and how it's forgotten, for me, I found this very inspiring because I think it really makes the case for why you would want a constitutional commitment explicitly establishing that sex equality is a core part of America's past, present, and future. And this is a constitutional commitment that we're declaring in as permanent a way as we can. So for me, I thought it naturally, to me, supports the case of the ERA.
Thank you. We have an amazing question from Chris Collins, and we don't have time to answer it, especially because I have to anticipate the next panel and some other things, but I'm going to read it anyway, and maybe during lunch conversations we might raise this. She reminds us of the delightful and excellent press conference in the National Archives decrying liberal historians, and also she doesn't mention that fabulous history conference that he held. But meanwhile, liberals today are often charged with too much infighting and emphasis on conflict to a degree that it becomes a political liability. How can we tell the story of women's suffrage to the public, or how can public officials tell that story in a way that does not fall into recrimination? And the question really for Jill is, how should the Supreme Court characterize the history of sex equality and women's status? I'm going to leave that open because we're going to have to close, but I think that's just a really critical question of what we've been doing all morning thus far, but including especially this panel of not just who tells our story, but how do we tell the story and what do we include? Is it problematic when we include conflict? And frankly, I don't think so, because varying interpretations, whether because we've learned new things or because we have different perspectives, becomes a part of the story. The question is, how do we include that conflict? Let me finish the comments on our morning of history, and then I'm going to say something about lunch and later today. Let me conclude our discussion of history by taking the question not just of the 19th Amendment and how we understand it, but when we're talking about women, how do we understand what that is? And I think Rachel has tipped us off a little into that question. But over time, our recognition of the very close tie between our understanding of what constitutes gender and what constitutes sexuality. As many of other scholars have pointed out, the issues of performance and gender, where it's possible for people to be declared not women because they act the wrong way, they dress the wrong way, they carry themselves the wrong way, they say the wrong things. In the contemporary era, when we've blown the whole question up since widespread recognition of transgender, I think the questions now about gender and empowerment and equality and inclusion are, if anything, much, much more complicated than they once were, because once upon a time, we thought we knew what women were and what men are. And now those definitions and our understanding of gender is so very varied and is so very contingent that I think that we are not nearly done with reinterpreting our history of gender and empowerment and what it meant in the past, in the current year, and in the future. So with that, there's so much more we could say, but our morning of history is done. Let me just say something about this afternoon. We're now moving to a lunch period where you can disappear if you want, or there's a list, and I hope somebody's going to put that in Q&A or chat or somewhere, of where you can go to Zoom with some of us who said we'd sit around schmoosing. If you want to schmoose, and that's as formal as it's going to get, it's going to be schmoosing. And then this afternoon, beginning at 12:15, we have the third panel. And remember, each webinar is a separate, because of what we're doing, is a separate thing you have to Zoom into. So panel 3 at 12:15, Women in the Electoral Arena, a Century Later. And this is a very exciting panel with Kelly Dittmar of Rutgers, working with office holders and activists in the Democratic and Republican Party and related. And then the fourth panel is back to scholars of a sampling of research about contemporary issues of gender and power and citizenship and so forth. And I just saw something that's telling me, please look out for an email from lawcom at BU.edu with registration links for the Zoom meetings. So please, everybody, join me virtually in thanking everybody who participated this morning. Those of us who have lunchtime discussions, join us or not, as you wish. And that's just informal. And other than that, we'll see you, I hope, at 12:15 for the next panel. And don't forget, at the end, we wrap at 3:30 with a whole bunch of us trying to figure out what we learned today. So thank you. See you later.